George stepped into his parents' warm, pine-scented home on Christmas Eve, Emma's hand resting lightly in his as the door clicked shut behind them. The living room was bathed in soft yellow light from the tree, its needles gleaming with ornaments collected over decades. His mother hummed a familiar Mariah Carey tune as she arranged platters of overcooked ham, tangy potato salad, and a sharply dressed salad that snapped when you lifted a forkful. His father sat at the head of the table, reading the evening paper as though he'd never met Emma, and George offered polite nods, tucking into the meal with practiced calm. His sister Claire sat nearby, swirling red wine in a crystal glass and wearing a beige coat that looked far too expensive for their small gathering. Claire's boyfriend laughed at a joke George barely heard, and every 9 minutes his parents paused, exchanged stiff smiles, and returned to their hushed conversation. George counted the seconds it took before his mother asked Emma about her new job, then counted again when his father inquired about her Zoom meetings, as though Emma were a stranger in a foreign land. Emma answered politely with soft confidence, but George noticed how her eyes flicked to his mother's clenched jaw, then to the half-empty wine decanter. When dessert arrived, a simple slice of pumpkin pie, his mother clasped her hands and declared she had a surprise. The old photo albums. George's heart thudded as she fetched 3 dusty volumes from the hallway closet, as though she had stalked their secrets all year. They settled on the couch in a tight semicircle. First came the birthdays and beach trips, yellowed snapshots of toddler smiles and sandy toes. Second came the school years, awkward uniforms and paint-splattered hands after art class. George flipped pages with the ease of someone who knew every image by heart, as though these memories were his own refuge against the chill outside. Then came the third album, him alone, stage by stage, first at 5 blowing out candles, then at 7 riding a bike with training wheels, and again at 9 standing stiffly in front of a stone wall. Emma sat close, her head tilted like a photographer scanning for flaws, her palm resting briefly on George's thigh. He felt her hand tighten, just enough to send a jolt through him. He met her gaze and saw something unreadable behind her calm. "Don't you see it?" she whispered, her voice low, urgent, yet calm enough that his mother did not notice. George froze, the album in his lap forgotten. His mother pointed at the next photo, a smiling George in a winter coat, and laughed about the Denver snowstorm of '01. Everyone leaned in, but George barely heard her words. Instead, his eyes darted over the pictures in front of him, trying to understand what Emma meant. His pulse raced in his ears, and the familiar hum of his childhood home felt suddenly strange, as though he were a visitor caught between frames of time. He nodded slowly, unsure if he had seen what Emma saw, but too afraid to look away. The album snapped shut with a polite clack, and in that moment, George realized that the story he had known all his life might be only a part of a much darker picture. George and Emma drove home through quiet Denver streets, the Christmas lights blurring past the car windows like distant memories. George's heart thudded in his chest, replaying Emma's whisper over and over. "Don't you see it?" Even though he still wasn't sure what it was. When they reached their Capitol Hill apartment, Emma paused at the door and looked at him, her dark eyes serious. "You need to see these alone," she said, and handed him 3 loose prints she'd plucked from his family's albums. George closed the door behind them, leaned against it, and took a deep breath. The first print showed him at 7 years old, smiling on a playground swing in front of a chain-link fence and a bright blue sky. He recognized the green swing set at Wash Park, but something about the shadows on his face felt off, as though the light had been painted in afterward. The next print captured him in a yellow raincoat beside a fountain in City Park. Again, that same tilt of his head, the same crinkle at the corner of his mouth. But the background looked nothing like the soft stone benches he remembered around the pond. The third print was the most jarring. A baby in a pale pink bonnet sitting on a picnic blanket covered in daisies. The hat tied under her chin with a neat bow, cheeks round and rosy. George stared, heart pounding. That baby wasn't him. He knew every memory he had before kindergarten, or at least he thought he did, and none included a bonnet or daisies or a picnic that felt like someone else's memory. Emma stood behind him in the narrow hallway, arms folded against her chest, watching his face in the hallway mirror. The apartment felt too small, the walls closing in with every breath he took. Finally, he laid the prints on the console table by the entrance and sank onto the couch, his sweater catching on the coarse fabric. Emma joined him, and together they spread the photos on the coffee table beneath the warm glow of the floor lamp. "Look at the expression," she said, tapping the first photo. "Same smile, same eyes. They copied you onto different places." George held the print in his trembling fingers. "Why would they do that?" he whispered. "Who?" Emma asked softly. "Your parents." He swallowed hard and remembered every staged holiday card, every retouched portrait he'd seen growing up. He thought of his mother's perfect English in every album caption, his father's stern nod at each picture as if confirming ownership. Emma pointed at the baby photo. "And who is this?" George closed his eyes and shook his head, fresh panic rising. "I don't know," he said. "I don't remember having baby pictures." His throat tightened. For a moment, the apartment fell silent, except for the soft hum of the air filter. Then Emma reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. "I copied these at your parents' after dessert," she admitted. "I wanted you to see them in private. They were loose, thrown in a pile." George pinned the prints under a glass dish to keep them from slipping as he asked, "What did you do?" Emma exhaled slowly and brought up her laptop on the coffee table. A blank document glowed on the screen. "I did some digging," she said. She opened a folder titled George Family History and clicked on a PDF of what looked like a birth certificate. The name listed was not George's, at least not his given name. It was another name entirely, and the place of birth was Sarajevo, dated December 19, 1997, matching his age, but half a world away. George felt the floor drop out beneath him. His hands shook so badly he could barely bring the documents into focus. Emma kept talking, but her words seemed distant, as if echoing in a cavern. She scrolled through a series of scanned records, a baby's medical file, stamped adopted, with signatures he didn't recognize, a letter from a refugee agency approving relocation to Denver, a set of photos of that same baby in a cramped apartment overseas, being comforted by a woman who looked nothing like his mother. George closed his eyes, trying to stop the world from spinning. "This can't be true," he said, but the jagged memory of his shadow in the photo at the stone wall flashed behind his eyelids. Emma reached over and squeezed his hand, gentle but firm. "I'm sorry," she said, "but your life as you know it, your childhood, your name, is a lie." George's breath caught, and a wave of cold disbelief and anger washed over him. He remembered the year his sister Claire was born, how the whole house had changed, new scrapbooks, camcorder tapes, themed parties. He had never questioned why he had none of those things, why every birthday cake photo of him had only two people, his parents, standing behind the candles. Now he realized they had hidden him behind a curtain of contrived nostalgia. His throat burned as he asked, "What do we do?" Emma tightened her grip. "We go to the police," she said simply. "We tell them everything." George stared at the prints one last time, the duplicated smiles, the borrowed backdrops, the unknown baby. Then he stared at Emma, the steady anchor who had pulled him out of a dream. The room was quiet except for their breathing. And in that quiet, George resolved that he would unravel the lie, piece by piece, until he found the truth of who he really was. George sat in the sterile, fluorescent glow of the Denver Police Department lobby, Emma by his side, clutching his hand as though they were tethered against a storm. The receptionist gave them a sympathetic look before pointing to a row of chairs where they waited. The loose prints of George's childhood fanned out on Emma's lap, like a stack of damning evidence. George's pulse drummed in his ears as he recalled the morning's call. Detective Alvarez would see them in 30 minutes to take his statement. When the door opened, a tall woman in a crisp suit greeted them with a firm handshake and led them to a small interview room lined with posters about community safety. Inside, a recorder clicked on, and Alvarez offered George a seat across from a low table. Emma pulled the prints from her lap and laid them in front of the detective, smoothing the corners as though to flatten the lies they contained. Alvarez flipped through the photos, brow furrowing at the identical smile cropped onto different backgrounds, then at the innocent baby portrait of a child George did not recognize. "Tell me what happened," Alvarez said, her tone gentle but unsparing. George took a breath and began at the beginning. The Christmas Eve dinner, the photo albums, Emma's quiet whisper under his mother's humming, the jolt of panic when his grip tightened on her hand, the loose prints rescued from the album pile. He described the mismatched shadows, the repetition of his own face in front of parks and fences he had never known, the phantom baby in pink with no place in his memory. Alvarez listened without interruption, eyes steady, occasionally jotting notes. When George paused, unsure how to name the betrayal, Emma filled the silence. I found his original birth certificate filed under a different name in a different country. All official documents bear signatures we've never seen. She produced the refugee agency letter, the adoption stamp, the overseas medical file. Alvarez leaned back, folding her arms. This is more than a family dispute, she said. These documents indicate child abduction, immigration fraud, concealing identity. We'll open a criminal investigation. George felt the room tilt as though he were falling again, but Emma squeezed his hand and held him upright. Alvarez asked for his parents' full names and the address where they now lived. George's lips trembled against the names he had once answered without question. By the time they left the interview room, Alvarez had logged the case and promised an investigator would visit George's parents to secure more evidence. Outside the station, the cold mountain air felt clean, real, and George inhaled deeply, determination rising inside him. He glanced at Emma's face, resolute, kind, and unwavering. "Thank you," he said, voice low. Instead of heading home, they drove to George's parents' house under the guise of just stopping by. When the door opened, his mother's painted smile faltered at the sight of the two of them arriving unannounced, her eyes flicking to Emma's hand on George's arm. His father led them inside, confusion etched on his face, while Claire peered from the staircase. George's chest tightened at the sight of the albums still on the coffee table. He cleared his throat. "We need to talk." His mother's lips pressed into a thin line as Emma extracted the photos from her purse and handed them to George's father. He watched the way his father's hand shook as he examined the prints, and remembered the gentle way he once tucked him into bed, the lie of that memory now as suspect as the photos. George stood before them, the quiet hum of the heater filling the space where explanations once belonged. "I filed a report at the station," he said calmly. "The detective will be here tomorrow to collect anything else we need." His mother's face drained of color, and his father's brow furrowed in disbelief. Claire descended the stairs silently, stopping beside their mother. "George, what's happening?" she asked, voice small. George held out the refugee letter and the overseas documents. "Look at these," he said gently, though his throat burned with betrayal. His mother's eyes flicked to the papers, her hands twisting the edge of her sleeve. "It's not true," she said quickly. "We only wanted to protect you from what?" George interrupted, voice rising on a fearful edge. "The war?" His father took a step forward. "We rescued you," he said, his voice cracking. "You'd have died." George swallowed hard. "I deserve the truth," he said. Silence settled over the living room, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Claire's eyes brimmed with tears as she regarded their parents with something new. Shock. His mother's shoulders slumped as though the weight of her lie had finally crushed her upright posture. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. I thought you'd never remember." George looked at Emma, who stood with her arms crossed, unwavering. "They falsified my papers," he said softly, "and they edited every photo to cover it up." He unfolded the original missing child flyer he'd obtained from the refugee agency, an image of a frightened 5-year-old boy in a red scarf, his name and age printed beneath the grainy photo. He held it aloft, the edges crinkling. "This," he said, voice steady, "is me. Milena Petrovich, age 5, last seen in Sarajevo." His mother sobbed, and Claire buried her face in her hands. His father's face twisted in remorse and fear. "We had no choice," his father said, voice barely audible. "You'd have been separated in camps." George's chest constricted with anger so fierce it felt like fire. And yet, beneath the flame, a hollow ache of something else. Sorrow. He had lost 2 mothers that day, the one who abandoned him, and the one who had stolen him. Emma stepped forward. "We'll let the police sort out the legal side," she said to him quietly, then turned to his parents. "But restitution will be pursued," she stated, voice firm. "Every dollar spent, tuition, medical, living expenses will be reclaimed." His mother looked at Emma, eyes wide with panic, as if she had never imagined consequences so dire. George felt the click of power return to his limbs. He nodded. "I want my life back," he said, voice low and sure, "and I want the truth out there." His parents sagged under the weight of their deception. Claire stepped between them, placing a hand on George's arm. "I'm sorry, I didn't know," she said. George nodded, accepting her apology as a small balm. He turned back to his parents and whispered, "Tomorrow, Detective Alvarez will collect more evidence. I suggest you cooperate." He walked past them, each step echoing on the hardwood floor, leaving behind the shattered remnants of his family's greatest secret and moving forward toward the life he would reclaim. George woke before dawn the next morning, the first gray light of Denver filtering through the blackout curtains as he lay stiff in bed, mind racing with yesterday's confrontation and the avalanche of secrets it had unearthed. He listened to Emma's steady breathing beside him and knew there was no rest until every lie was exposed. After a quick shower, he dressed in a plain navy suit, the kind of outfit that said, "I mean business," without shouting it, and together they made their way to Detective Alvarez's district office. Inside, Alvarez greeted them with a solemn nod and ushered them into the same cramped interview room where George had first poured out his story. Today, the table was piled with folders stamped "Evidence" and "For official use only," each document a shard of truth ripped from the fabric of his stolen past. Alvarez slid the refugee agency's missing child flyer across to George, along with an official report from Interpol's War Crimes Unit, confirming dozens of child abduction cases in Sarajevo during late 2002. The babysitter's name, Mirjana Kovac, was listed as a suspect in a companion file, and George's parents had used her signature on the original adoption papers. He felt bile rise in his throat at the realization that every signature they'd forced him to trust was someone else's. Alvarez explained that her detective team had tracked Mirjana to a small town outside Belgrade and arranged an interview through Serbian authorities. That afternoon, George and Emma would fly to Europe to meet Mara Petrovic, his birth mother. But before they left, they wanted one last crucial piece of evidence: Mirjana's statement. The detective tapped a printed transcript. Mirjana admitted that George's parents had paid her €50 to sign the papers, promising to reunite her with her family once he was safely across the border, promises she never intended to keep. George's hands shook as he read her words. "They told me you were saving her life. I didn't know it would be forever." The tremor in his voice betrayed him when he said, "This is it, the proof." Alvarez printed a court order authorizing extradition of the documents and granted George permission to use the transcript in both his civil restitution claim and the criminal investigation. George felt a grim satisfaction. The babysitter's confession would pierce the heart of his parents' lies and expose their calculated betrayal. After Alvarez delivered copies to his attorney and arranged for secure transport of the documents to Serbia, George and Emma hurried to the airport, their senses alive to every detail of the day. On the flight, George replayed the detective's explanation that the transcript and adoption papers, once authenticated by a Serbian magistrate, would allow Mara to file new charges of parental abduction in her country, ensuring George's legal identity was restored in both the United States and Serbia. He thought of the years he had lived under a false name, the graduations, the first kiss, the late-night study sessions, all built on the shifting sands of a manufactured life. As the plane descended into Belgrade, George pressed his palm to the window, the sprawling city beneath him like a map of his unknown history waiting to be charted. He felt both fear and fierce excitement at meeting Mara in person, at finally seeing the face that matched his own, at bridging the gulf between who he had been told he was and who he truly was. They retrieved their bags and were greeted by a Serbian liaison officer who escorted them through customs with quiet efficiency. Mara waited in a small arrivals lounge, clutching a faded bouquet of chrysanthemums and wearing a gray coat that swirled around her knees like mist. When she stepped forward, her eyes brimmed with tears, and she whispered a name he did not know, his childhood name, Milena, before launching herself into his arms. The moment fractured something inside George, and he held her as though she were both stranger and savior, her presence raw proof of every memory he had recovered. Mara led them to a modest cafe down the street where she produced an old, leather-bound journal she had kept since that terrible summer. Inside were entries in shaky Serbian script, pleas for news of her daughter, descriptions of every police station visited, every leaflet posted along crumbling apartment walls. One entry, dated June 2003, described the day she learned George had been adopted by an American couple. How she collapsed in frustration, how the war had scattered so many children that truth became hard to find, how the words, "my child is safe," were both comfort and curse. George traced each line with trembling fingers, the sorrow and love in Mara's handwriting seeping into his heart. They spent hours in that cafe, translating the entries together, Mara's voice catching as she recounted every dead end and every false hope. Emma took notes on her laptop, her face grave with understanding, knowing that these entries would become a centerpiece of George's case file, proof of his parents' deception and evidence of the anguish they had wrought. As dusk settled over Belgrade, George and Mara stepped onto a bridge overlooking the Sava River, its lights glittering like broken promises made whole by reflection. They talked in hushed tones about his earliest memories, about the immigrant office in Denver where he first cried for Mama, and about the therapists who had tried to stitch his fractured mind back together. Mara pressed a photograph into his hand, a grainy shot of her holding him in her arms, taken by a humanitarian worker just hours before he was taken away. The date on the back matched his 5th birthday. George stared at the image, feeling the weight of stolen years and the burning potential of reclaimed ones. He slipped it into his coat pocket and looked at Mara. "I'm going to bring them to justice," he said softly. "For you, for me, for every lie they told." She nodded, her hand fluttering over her heart as tears glistened on her cheeks. Behind them, the city lights pulsed in a steady rhythm, a reminder that stories, no matter how dark, could find new chapters when truth took center stage. In that moment, George felt the final piece of his identity settle into place, knitting together past and present with the strong thread of revelation. He drew a deep breath and stepped forward. The hidden bombshells had been uncovered. Now the world would hear his real name and the real story of how he fought to reclaim not just his childhood, but his very self. George returned to Denver 6 weeks later, the winter air crisp against his cheeks as he stepped off the plane with Mara and Emma at his side, their small group weaving through the crowded terminal under fluorescent lights that felt more comforting than the gray skies outside. He carried with him a thick binder of translated documents, Interpol reports, Mirjana Kovac's signed confession, Mara's heartfelt journal entries, and official Serbian court orders confirming his true birth name as Milena Petrovic. At immigration, he presented the new passport bearing that name, watching the officer's eyebrow lift at the unfamiliar spelling before stamping it without comment. Outside, a black SUV waited, its driver greeting them with a crisp nod. As they glided through Denver's streets, George rehearsed the words he would speak in court the next morning. A declaration of identity, a demand for justice, and a reckoning for the lies that had shaped his life. The following day, sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Jefferson County Courthouse, illuminating the gleaming nameplate that read, "People of the State of Colorado v. Patricia and Robert Clark." George took a steadying breath in the hallway outside courtroom 3B, Mara's hand warm on his shoulder, Emma's steady presence grounding him as he adjusted the lapel of his navy suit. His attorney, a poised woman named Ellis, gave him a reassuring nod, then beckoned him inside. The gallery was lined with rows of empty benches, but George's family occupied the front row. Claire, with red-rimmed eyes, her boyfriend's hand resting on her knee, a handful of friends and colleagues who had rallied behind a GoFundMe to cover legal costs, and Detective Alvarez, seated with a stack of exhibits at her feet. At the defense table sat his parents, their faces drawn taut with worry, attorneys flitting in and out of whispered conferences. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Ramirez, an imposing figure with silver hair and kind eyes, reviewed the charges: abduction of a minor, document fraud, concealment of a child's true identity, and financial restitution for damages. When the proceedings turned to the victim impact statement, George rose and stepped to the podium. His throat tightened as he gazed at his parents' downcast faces, but he drew on every moment of heartbreak and betrayal to give voice to a lifetime of stolen memories. "Your Honor," he began, voice steady, "I stand before you not as the person I believed myself to be, but as the child I was meant to become." He clicked a remote, and the projector illuminated the grainy refugee flyer and the baby photo in a pink bonnet, images that had haunted his dreams for years. "This," he said, pointing to the flyer, "is Melina Petrovich, age 5, taken from her mother in Sarajevo during a war she could not survive alone. And this," he tapped the bonneted child, "is a stranger, faked into my family's albums to erase my true past." His words cut through the silent courtroom like a blade. He continued, describing the hollow ache of a childhood lived under borrowed names, the pang of every staged holiday card, the phantom longing for a mother he had loved and lost. He spoke of nights curled on his apartment floor in a panic, the first time 911 connected him to a moment of reckoning, and the fierce hope that had driven him to unravel decades of deceit. "I am here to reclaim my name, my history, and the years that were taken from me," he said, voice firm with conviction. "I ask this court not only to hold my parents accountable, but to affirm that a child's identity is not a commodity to be bought or sold, and that every human being deserves the truth of their own life." George's gaze swept over the assembled faces, friends, supporters, even his estranged sister, and landed finally on his parents. He saw in their eyes remorse and fear, but offered no solace. Instead, he pressed on. "I seek restitution for every expense incurred in my false life. Tuition, medical bills, housing costs, therapy sessions to mend my fractured mind. I demand the return of every dollar spent on a stolen childhood." A faint murmur rippled through the gallery at the unprecedented scope of his claim, but George held his ground. He laid out a detailed ledger. School tuitions paid under the name George Clark, orthodontist bills for braces he never needed under that persona, travel expenses for family vacations built on lies. Each figure underscored the depth of his parents' betrayal and the tangible cost of their deception. Judge Ramirez listened intently, occasionally consulting notes, then invited the defense to respond. George stepped down from the podium, waves of relief mingling with residual tension. His parents' lawyer offered a contrite apology, acknowledging the painful mistakes and requesting leniency given their advanced age and lack of prior offenses. But when the judge announced his verdict, finding Patricia and Robert Clark guilty on all counts and ordering them to pay full restitution plus damages, revoke their legal guardianship in name only, and honor Melina's right to inherit her original nationality, George felt a surge of both vindication and sorrow. The judge's words echoed in his mind. "No further appeals are permitted. Case closed." Outside the courtroom, reporters clamored for statements, but George approached the crowd with Mara and Emma flanking him. He spoke briefly. "Today, justice was done. I am Melina Petrovic again." Reporters scribbled as he added, "I forgive my parents for what they did, but I cannot forget. I move forward with my real mother, my real name, and a future built on truth." The flash of cameras and the buzz of voices faded behind him as he stepped into the clear winter sky. Claire wrapped him in a tight embrace, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." Mara kissed his cheek, tears glinting in her eyes as she murmured, "Welcome home, my daughter." Emma slipped an arm around his waist, and George inhaled the tang of cold air mixed with hope. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, the city's skyline etched against the dawn, George felt the final weight of his stolen past lift. He had torn down the false frames, reclaimed each stolen memory, and emerged as the person he had always been meant to be, whole, named, and free.